Mrs. Matthews, a kind, elderly woman in her late 70s, had been a loyal customer at her local bank for decades. Every Friday, without fail, she would visit the bank to handle her finances. For her, it was a routine that had become second nature over the years. She was comfortable with the process and the familiar faces of the tellers, who always greeted her with warm smiles and kind words. To her, the bank was a place she trusted, a place where she had never once felt out of place. That morning, like every other, Mrs. Matthews took the bus to the bank. She was dressed in her usual light blue cardigan, a soft scarf around her neck, and her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Her cane clicked on the pavement as she made her way to the door. The world outside was bustling with activity, but for her, it was just another quiet day. She entered the bank with a sense of calm, looking forward to completing her simple transaction. As she approached the counter, she smiled at the teller, a young woman with bright red lipstick and a distracted look on her face. Mrs. Matthews had noticed the teller a few times before and was used to her somewhat hurried demeanor. Today, however, something felt off. "Good morning, young lady," Mrs. Matthews said with a smile, settling herself in front of the counter. The teller barely looked up, muttering a quick greeting, "Morning." There was something about her tone that made Mrs. Matthews feel uneasy. She brushed it off, figuring the young woman was just busy. After all, it was a Friday, and the bank was usually quite crowded on this day of the week. "I'd like to withdraw some cash, dear," Mrs. Matthews said, placing her checkbook on the counter. She was used to this process, always ensuring she had all the necessary paperwork ready to go. The teller glanced at the checkbook for a moment, then back at Mrs. Matthews. "I'll need a government-issued ID," she said flatly, her voice lacking the warmth Mrs. Matthews had come to expect. Mrs. Matthews hesitated for a moment. She had been coming to this bank for years, and she had never been asked to provide an ID for a simple withdrawal. But she didn't think much of it. Perhaps it was a new policy. Reaching into her purse, she retrieved her ID, a state-issued driver's license, and handed it over. The bank had Bass Mr. The weeks following the bank incident passed slowly for Mrs. Matthews, but there was a quiet strength in her step now that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that life had become perfect, there were still the small daily struggles that come with age, the aches and pains that accompanied getting older, and the usual worries about health and family. But she no longer felt the sting of invisibility that had once followed her wherever she went. Something had changed inside her, something profound and powerful. She had learned to stand up for herself, and more importantly, she had learned that kindness could show up in the most unexpected places. Vin Diesel's intervention had been a momentary act, but it had made a lasting impact on her. The world had felt a little less cold that day, and she couldn't help but carry that warmth with her in the weeks that followed. One bright morning, as she sipped her tea and sat by the window watching the city wake up, Mrs. Matthews received a call from the bank. It wasn't the usual reminder about her account or a notification of a policy change. This time, it was the branch manager himself, Mr. Harris. "Good morning, Mrs. Matthews," he said, his voice warm. "I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to follow up on our conversation a few weeks ago and see if there's anything more we can do to make sure you feel comfortable with our services." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. She hadn't expected to hear from him, much less so soon after everything had settled. But as he continued speaking, Mrs. Matthews realized that something was different. Mr. Harris wasn't just calling to apologize again or to smooth things over. He genuinely seemed concerned about her well-being. "We've been working on improving how we handle our customers, especially in sensitive situations," he explained. "And I wanted to personally ensure that your experience with us was handled the way it should have been from the beginning. We've had some staff training on empathy and customer service, and I just wanted you to know that you're always welcome here." Mrs. Matthews listened carefully, feeling both gratitude and surprise. She didn't expect much from a corporate apology, but there was something in Mr. Harris's tone that made her believe that the bank had truly changed its approach. She was being treated not just as a customer but as a valued person. "Thank you for calling, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice calm and collected. "I really appreciate the gesture. It's not often that someone takes the time to make things right." "That's exactly what we're trying to do," he said. "And we hope to see you again soon, Mrs. Matthews. Please know that if you ever have any issues, we'll be here to help." After hanging up the phone, Mrs. Matthews sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on how far she had come since that day at the bank. What had once seemed like an embarrassing and frustrating experience had turned into a lesson in standing up for herself, and it had sparked a change that she hadn't expected. The world, it seemed, was capable of more kindness than she had given it credit for. Later that week, Mrs. Matthews decided to return to the bank, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't returning to confront anyone or to make a statement. She simply needed to take care of some business, and she felt confident that it would go smoothly. As she walked into the bank, the same familiar faces greeted her. She recognized the teller who had been so dismissive the last time, but this time, she noticed something different in the way the woman looked at her. There was respect in her eyes, a shift that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Matthews approached the counter, and the young teller smiled at her. "Good morning, Mrs. Matthews. How can I help you today?" The change was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Matthews had a sense that the teller had been through some sort of training, perhaps learning about customer service and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of age or appearance. It was a small but significant shift in how she was being treated. "I just need to make a simple deposit," Mrs. Matthews replied, her voice steady and clear. As the teller processed her transaction, Mrs. Matthews found herself reflecting on how much had changed. She remembered how helpless she had felt just a few weeks ago, when she had been humiliated and made to feel small. Now, she was walking into the same bank with her head held high, not because of any grand gesture, but because of her own inner strength. After the teller completed her transaction, Mrs. Matthews gathered her things and prepared to leave. But just as she was about to step away from the counter, she noticed someone approaching her from the corner of her eye. It was the manager, Mr. Harris. "Mrs. Matthews," he said with a warm smile, "I just wanted to personally thank you for your patience and understanding. We've learned a lot from your experience, and we're committed to doing better moving forward." Mrs. Matthews smiled back, touched by his words. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," she replied. "I'm glad to see the changes. It means a lot to me." As she left the bank, Mrs. Matthews couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just that the bank had improved its service. It was that she had played a part in making that happen. Her decision to stand up for herself, her refusal to be treated unfairly, had led to real change. In the following days, Mrs. Matthews found herself thinking more about how small acts of kindness and courage could ripple out and change the world. She thought about Vin Diesel, how his unexpected act of kindness had not only helped her but had also sparked something bigger, a wave of awareness about the importance of treating others with respect. Mrs. Matthews decided that she wanted to keep that spirit alive. She began volunteering at the local community center, offering her time and energy to help those in need. She wanted to pass on the kindness she had received, to remind others that they, too, deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter their circumstances. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Matthews noticed the impact her small actions were having. More people in her community began to stand up for one another. People who had once been silent now found their voices. And as for her, she no longer felt invisible. She had found her place, not just in her community, but in a world that was capable of kindness, if only people were willing to take a moment to show it. In the end, it wasn't the celebrity moment or the apology that had changed Mrs. Matthews' life, it was the realization that kindness, when given freely, could transform not just one person's day, but an entire community. And that was a lesson she would carry with her forever. And sense of relief wash over her. The cool air outside felt refreshing, a stark contrast to the tense, uncomfortable atmosphere she had just left behind. For the first time that day, she took a deep breath, letting the calmness of the outside world seep into her. It wasn't just the physical act of leaving the bank that brought her relief, it was the way she had been treated in the end. The rude treatment she had received earlier seemed distant now, almost like it belonged to someone else. In its place was a sense of dignity that she hadn't expected to regain. Her encounter with Vin Diesel had made all the difference. She walked slowly, her cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement as she made her way to the bus stop. Her mind was still buzzing with what had happened. Could it really be true? Could she, a regular elderly woman, really have received help from someone as famous as Vin Diesel? It seemed almost surreal, like something out of a movie. But she knew it wasn't. It had really happened. As she waited for the bus, Mrs. Matthews couldn't help but reflect on how things had unfolded. When she had first walked into the bank that morning, she had never imagined it would turn into such an ordeal. All she wanted was to complete her simple task, withdraw some money and go home. But instead, she had found herself caught in a situation that left her feeling small and unimportant. It wasn't the first time she had felt invisible, but it had never been so blatant, so direct. She had been treated like an inconvenience, not a valued customer. It was a painful realization, and it had hurt her deeply. But then, just as she was about to give up, Vin Diesel had appeared. He hadn't been there to cause a scene or to make a spectacle. No, he had simply stepped in to help. His words had been firm, but not harsh, gentle, but not condescending. He had treated her like a person, with dignity and respect. The way he had stood up for her without hesitation had made all the difference. She hadn't felt so empowered in years. The bus arrived, and Mrs. Matthews climbed aboard. The driver smiled at her as she took her seat, and she offered a quiet smile in return. The ride home was uneventful, but for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. The familiar sights of her neighborhood welcomed her as the bus made its way down the street. It was a simple place, but it was home, and that brought her comfort. When she finally reached her apartment building, she paused for a moment outside the door. She took a deep breath, letting the feeling of calmness continue to wash over her. She had handled the situation at the bank, and she had come out on top. She hadn't let the rudeness or the humiliation break her. In fact, it had only made her stronger. Mrs. Matthews entered her apartment, locking the door behind her. She set her purse down on the table and sat in her favorite chair by the window. She looked out at the city, watching the cars go by. Everything seemed so ordinary, yet in her heart, she knew that something extraordinary had happened. She had been helped by someone who didn't have to care, someone who had no reason to step in, yet he had. That thought stayed with her throughout the evening. Later that night, as she sat down for a quiet dinner, Mrs. Matthews found herself thinking more about the situation. It wasn't just about the bank, or the mistake the teller had made, or even the manager's apology. It was about how quickly things could change when someone decided to stand up for what was right. Vin Diesel didn't know her, didn't know anything about her life or her struggles, but he saw her in that moment and chose to act. And that was what mattered. In a world where it often felt like people were too busy to care, where kindness seemed like a rare commodity, she had experienced the power of someone simply doing the right thing. And that made all the difference. The next day, Mrs. Matthews woke up with a sense of clarity that she hadn't had in a long time. She was still a little shaken from the events of the previous day, but she had a renewed sense of confidence. She wasn't just the elderly woman who had been humiliated at the bank anymore. No, she was the woman who had been treated with respect by someone who cared enough to make a difference. And that made her feel stronger than she had felt in years. As the days passed, Mrs. Matthews found herself telling a few of her friends about what had happened. At first, they had a hard time believing her, thinking she was just telling an outlandish story. But when she mentioned Vin Diesel's name, they were all ears. Her friends, who had seen him on the big screen in action-packed movies, were amazed that someone like him would do something so kind for a complete stranger. "What was he like?" one of her friends asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mrs. Matthews smiled. "He was kind. Genuine. He didn't make a big fuss or try to get attention. He just stepped in and made sure I was treated with respect." Her friends were impressed, and word of the story soon spread throughout her community. People began to speak more about kindness and how little acts could make a huge impact on someone's day. The incident at the bank, while painful at first, had sparked a chain of kindness that went far beyond Mrs. Matthews herself. People started to remember the importance of treating others with dignity, no matter their age or appearance. But Mrs. Matthews knew that it wasn't just about the story spreading. It was about the message that she carried with her now, that she deserved to be treated with respect, no matter what. And more importantly, she knew that there were still good people in the world, people who would stand up for what was right when it mattered most. As the days went by, life returned to its normal pace for Mrs. Matthews. She continued to visit the bank, though now with a new sense of confidence. The staff, perhaps a little more aware of their behavior after what had happened, treated her with kindness and courtesy. The manager even took the time to speak with her on a few occasions, always making sure that her needs were met promptly. And though she never expected anything like that to happen again, Mrs. Matthews was grateful for the lesson she had learned, that even in a world that sometimes seemed indifferent, one act of kindness could change everything. Come a place of tension, with Mrs. Matthews feeling increasingly isolated and humiliated. She stood there, trying to hold back the tears as the manager continued to insist on his rigid policies. Her hands, on the bank, had gone eerily quiet after Vin Diesel's intervention. Mrs. Matthews stood there, still holding her purse in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined she would find herself in a situation like this one, where a celebrity would come to her rescue in a moment of deep humiliation. But there he was, standing close by, his presence calm and reassuring. The weight of the room had shifted, and the tension that had filled the air seemed to dissipate as Vin Diesel's words lingered in everyone's mind. Mrs. Matthews slowly glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had been silent witnesses to the scene. They, too, seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. The bank teller, who had been so dismissive just moments ago, now looked down at her screen, her posture slightly hunched. The manager, once so firm in his stance, now seemed unsure of how to proceed, almost as if the whole situation had taken him by surprise. It was as though they were all waiting for the next move, unsure of what to do or say. Vin Diesel, for his part, didn't seem rushed. He didn't push anyone or demand anything. He simply stood by, silently offering his support to Mrs. Matthews, allowing her the space she needed to gather her thoughts. His calm demeanor contrasted with the flustered state of the bank staff, who were still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. Mrs. Matthews felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She had been ready to give up, to walk out of that bank in defeat. But now, with Vin Diesel standing beside her, she felt stronger, like she wasn't alone in the world. He wasn't just a famous actor to her in that moment, he was a symbol of kindness and compassion, someone who had seen the injustice and had acted without hesitation. The manager, now realizing the gravity of the situation, looked back at Mrs. Matthews. He cleared his throat and finally spoke up, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his tone much softer now. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding, and we'll make sure everything is processed correctly." Mrs. Matthews nodded, still unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not from someone who had treated her so indifferently. But she could feel the sincerity in his voice, and that made her pause for a moment. Maybe he truly hadn't meant to treat her that way. Maybe it was just a matter of poor judgment. "I appreciate that," she said quietly, her voice trembling a little. "But I've been a customer here for years, and I've never been treated like this before. I just want to complete my transaction and move on with my day. Vin Diesel stepped forward slightly, his presence a quiet but firm reminder of what had just transpired. That's all anyone ever wants, he said, his voice warm yet resolute. To be treated fairly. To be treated like a human being. It's not a lot to ask for. The manager, now thoroughly humbled, nodded in agreement. Of course, you're absolutely right. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll personally handle your transaction today. With that, Mrs. Matthews was finally able to complete her withdrawal. The process, once delayed and stressful, was now being handled with the respect she deserved. As the teller processed the paperwork, she did so with a newfound attentiveness, taking extra care to ensure everything was done properly. Mrs. Matthews could feel the difference in the way she was being treated. The coldness had melted away, replaced with a level of service she had once expected from the bank. Vin Diesel stayed by her side as the transaction was completed. He didn't rush her or pressure her in any way. He simply stood there, offering a silent kind of support that spoke volumes. The staff, once so dismissive, now seemed to be walking on eggshells around him. And Mrs. Matthews couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for that, for the fact that someone had stepped in when she needed it most. As the teller handed her the cash, Mrs. Matthews took a deep breath. She felt a sense of relief that the ordeal was finally over. But more than that, she felt empowered. She had walked into that bank with every intention of completing a simple transaction, and instead, she had been forced to face an uncomfortable situation where she was made to feel less than. But with Vin Diesel's intervention, she had regained her dignity. "You're all set, ma'am," the teller said, her voice almost apologetic now. She offered a small smile, though it was clear she still felt awkward after everything that had happened. "Thank you," Mrs. Matthews replied, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. She glanced at Vin Diesel, who gave her a reassuring nod. As she turned to leave, she felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, she was glad to be done with the bank, ready to return to the comfort of her home. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling of warmth that Vin Diesel had left her with. She had entered the bank that morning feeling invisible, like her voice didn't matter. But now, after everything that had unfolded, she felt seen, heard, and respected. "Thank you again," she said, looking up at Vin Diesel. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight of gratitude that she couldn't fully express in just one sentence. Vin smiled warmly at her, his eyes kind. "No need to thank me," he said, his voice gentle. "You deserve to be treated well. Everyone does." With that, Mrs. Matthews turned and walked out of the bank, her head held high. The sunlight outside felt different now, brighter, warmer, as if the world had shifted just a little bit in her favor. The bus stop was just a short walk away, and as she made her way there, she couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. It wasn't every day that a celebrity would step in to help a stranger, especially in such a personal way. But Vin Diesel had done just that. And in doing so, he had reminded Mrs. Matthews of something important, that no matter how old you are, or what you look like, your dignity and your worth are never up for debate. As she boarded the bus and took her seat, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. The world had been a little kinder that day, and for that, she was grateful. Steady and confident, now trembled at her sides. She had never imagined that a simple task like withdrawing cash would turn into such an ordeal. But just as she was about to speak again, to beg for the kindness and understanding that she thought every customer should receive, the door to the bank swung open. A figure stood in the doorway, pausing for a moment before stepping inside. Mrs. Matthews glanced up, her mind too clouded with confusion and frustration to immediately recognize the man. But it didn't take long for everyone in the room to notice him. It was Vin Diesel. The actor, who had become a household name for his roles in the Fast and the Furious franchise, stood there in the doorway, a calm and collected presence that seemed almost out of place in a quiet bank. He was dressed casually, wearing a black jacket, dark jeans, and a pair of sunglasses perched on his head. His presence alone seemed to carry a certain weight, as if the room shifted slightly with his arrival. Mrs. Matthews wasn't entirely sure what was happening. For a brief second, she thought she might be imagining things. But no, it was him. Vin Diesel, the man she had seen on the big screen countless times, was standing right there in front of her. She blinked, trying to shake off the surreal feeling that had taken over her senses. What was he doing here? Vin Diesel looked around the room, his gaze quickly scanning the situation. He saw the bank teller, still standing behind the counter, looking unbothered by the tension in the air. He noticed the manager, Mr. Harris, who was speaking in an overly professional tone, seemingly unaware of the discomfort Mrs. Matthews was feeling. And then his eyes landed on her. He saw her, the elderly woman standing in front of the counter, her face a mixture of confusion and frustration. He noticed the way she clutched her purse with both hands, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of the situation. In that moment, Vin Diesel didn't see an elderly woman or a bank customer. He saw someone who was being treated unfairly, someone who deserved respect, and someone who wasn't being given the benefit of the doubt. Without hesitation, Vin Diesel took a few steps toward the counter. His movements were purposeful, and he exuded a quiet confidence that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the bank. Mrs. Matthews turned to him, her eyes widening slightly in disbelief. She had never imagined she'd be in a situation like this, let alone have a celebrity come to her aid. "Is there a problem here?" Vin Diesel asked, his voice calm but firm, carrying a hint of authority that instantly made the room go quiet. The bank teller, who had been previously unconcerned, suddenly froze. She glanced at the manager, unsure of how to respond to the unexpected intrusion. Mr. Harris, who had been trying to maintain control over the situation, looked up at Vin Diesel, clearly startled. "Well, Mr. Harris began, his voice faltering slightly. He was clearly thrown off guard by the actor's presence. "There's no problem, sir. We're just following standard protocol here." Vin Diesel didn't seem to be convinced by the explanation. His gaze didn't waver as he looked from the manager to Mrs. Matthews, then back to the teller. There was something in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't about to let this slide. He could see the injustice of it all. He turned back to the manager, his tone still calm but now carrying a firmness that demanded respect. "I don't think this lady is getting the service she deserves," he said. "She's been coming to this bank for years, and you're making her feel like she doesn't belong here. That's not right." The manager hesitated. He didn't know how to handle a situation where an internationally known actor was suddenly involved. The power dynamics had shifted entirely, and now he was the one feeling out of place. "You don't understand," the manager started, but Vin Diesel raised a hand, cutting him off. "No, I do understand," Vin said, his voice steady. "I understand that she's a customer, and she's been treated like an inconvenience. I understand that she's not just an account number to you. She's a person." The room was silent. The tension that had been thick in the air before now seemed even more palpable, but it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was charged with a sense of anticipation. Mrs. Matthews, still standing by the counter, watched the scene unfold. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but there was something new bubbling inside her now, a sense of hope. Could this really be happening? Was someone actually standing up for her? The bank teller, who had been standing there in stunned silence, finally looked down at her screen. She seemed unsure of what to do next. She wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by someone like Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel's gaze shifted to the teller, and there was a hint of warmth behind his seriousness now. "You're doing your job, but you're forgetting to treat people with respect. It's not hard to be kind. If you just show a little bit of care, you'd be amazed at how much smoother things can go." The words seemed to sink in, and for the first time in the entire exchange, the teller's expression softened. She nodded, as though she was finally realizing the error of her ways. "I'm sorry," the teller said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't mean to make her feel that way." Vin Diesel nodded, acknowledging her apology. He then turned back to Mrs. Matthews, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "You're all right," he said, his voice gentle. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. You have the right to be treated with dignity, just like anyone else." Mrs. Matthews felt a lump form in her throat, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. The kindness she was being shown was overwhelming, and she realized, for the first time that day, that maybe everything wasn't as hopeless as it had seemed. Maybe there was still good in the world. As the manager reluctantly agreed to process her transaction, Vin Diesel stepped aside, giving Mrs. Matthews space to complete her withdrawal. He stayed close, though, his presence a quiet reminder that kindness and fairness still had a place in the world. The scene in the bank had shifted entirely, from one of discomfort and judgment to one of respect and understanding. It was all thanks to the unexpected appearance of a famous actor who, in that moment, had become an unlikely ally. The teller took a long look at the ID, then set it aside without saying a word. She started typing something into the computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Mrs. Matthews began to feel an odd sense of discomfort. The teller's expression remained unchanged as she continued to type, occasionally glancing at the ID. "Is something wrong, dear?" Mrs. Matthews asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was trying her best to stay calm, but the situation was beginning to feel strange. The teller didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tapped a few more keys on the keyboard and then turned her gaze back to Mrs. Matthews. "I'm sorry, but I'll need additional proof of identity," she said, her tone cold and impersonal. Mrs. Matthews felt a pang of confusion. She had been a customer here for years, and never had she been asked to provide more than one form of identification. But the teller's face gave nothing away, and the more Mrs. Matthews tried to speak, the more distant the teller seemed. "Why do you need more, dear? I've been a customer here for decades." "You can check your records if you need to," Mrs. Matthews said, her voice soft but firm. The teller finally looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was annoyed by the question. "I'm sorry, but that's the policy," she replied, handing back the ID with a dismissive wave. "We can't process this without further verification." Mrs. Matthews felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't want to make a scene, but something about this felt wrong. It was as if the teller was doubting her, questioning her integrity for no reason. And to Mrs. Matthews, it didn't make sense. She was just here for a simple transaction. But the teller's impersonal manner, her refusal to even look at Mrs. Matthews as a human being, was starting to chip away at her usual calm demeanor. "Can you please get your manager, dear?" Mrs. Matthews asked, her voice wavering slightly as she tried to maintain control over her emotions. The teller sighed, obviously irritated by the request. She stood up and walked away without a word, leaving Mrs. Matthews standing at the counter feeling more and more uncomfortable with each passing second. The minutes stretched on, and Mrs. Matthews began to feel the weight of the room closing in on her. People were talking around her, but she couldn't make out the words. She felt like she was trapped in an invisible bubble, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. Finally, the manager arrived. He was a man in his 40s, dressed in a crisp suit with a name tag reading Mr. Harris. He looked at Mrs. Matthews with a practiced smile, but there was something cold about it. "Hello, ma'am. I understand there's a problem," he asked in a polite but dismissive tone. "I'm not sure what's going on, sir," Mrs. Matthews began, her voice shaking now. "I've been a customer here for years, and I've never been asked to show more than one form of identification for a simple withdrawal. I'm just trying to take care of my business." Mr. Harris glanced at the teller, who seemed to be avoiding eye contact with both of them. He then turned back to Mrs. Matthews and gave a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, but we need to follow protocol. We can't make exceptions." Mrs. Matthews felt her face flush with embarrassment. She had never been treated like this before, not even when she was a young woman. The humiliation of being questioned in front of others, being treated like she didn't belong, was starting to sting. Her hands shook as she held onto her purse, her grip tightening as she tried to hold herself together. But she was losing confidence, and the more she tried to explain herself, the more distant the staff became. She felt like a small child in the midst of a confusing, unjust situation. And just as the feeling of humiliation reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A figure appeared in the doorway, drawing the attention of everyone in the room.